How does a 30-pound dog become the difference between survival and death for an entire infantry company? What drives an animal to return repeatedly into artillery fire, searching through snow-buried trenches for men who might already be frozen corpses? And when German armor is hours away from overrunning your position, can you trust a scarred mutt to find the wounded soldiers your own eyes cannot see? The questions weren't theoretical for Captain Michael Reese on the morning of January 8, 1945. His company, what remained of it after 3 weeks of brutal Ardennes fighting, occupied a ridgeline that maps designated as Hill 447, though the frozen soldiers who held it had long since stopped using official names. They called it Hell Ridge, and the name fit better than any cartographer's designation. The German artillery strike hit at 0540 hours, catching the company during stand to, when every man was supposed to be alert in his fighting position. Supposed to be, but exhaustion and cold had dulled reflexes honed by months of combat. The first salvo landed along the forward trenches, 88mm shells that detonated with precision, suggesting German observers had spent days marking targets. The second salvo walked back toward the command post, each explosion throwing frozen earth and shattered timber skyward in fountains of destruction. Reese threw himself into the communications trench as the third salvo began, feeling the concussive waves punch through the air like invisible fists. His radio man, Private Torres, crouched beside him, clutching equipment that had already taken shrapnel damage during the initial barrage. The radio sparked once, emitted a sound like tearing metal, then went silent. Their link to battalion headquarters, their connection to artillery support and reinforcement requests, died in the span of seconds. When the shelling stopped after what felt like hours but was probably 8 minutes, Reese emerged to assess damage that made his chest tighten with professional dread. The forward trench line had collapsed in 3 places, where shells had landed directly in the excavations, burying whatever soldiers had been there under tons of snow, frozen earth, and debris. Smoke and snow dust obscured visibility beyond 20 yards. Screams for medics echoed from multiple positions, the sound mixing with the peculiar silence that always followed artillery barrages, as if the world itself was too shocked to resume normal noise. Sergeant Bill Hayes appeared through the smoke, blood streaming from his nose and ears from concussion effects. Forward positions are gone. Sir, collapsed trenches, men buried, can't tell how many survived. His voice had the flat affect of someone reporting information his mind couldn't fully process. Medics are trying to dig them out, but the ground's frozen solid and we don't know who's under there or where exactly they're buried. Reese made rapid calculations. Digging blindly through collapsed trenches would take hours they didn't have, especially with frozen ground that required pickaxes to penetrate. But abandoning men who might be alive underneath tons of snow was unthinkable. He needed information: who was buried, where exactly they were located, whether they were alive or already gone. And he needed it faster than human searchers could provide. That's when he saw Ash. The dog emerged from the command post bunker where he'd taken shelter during the barrage, moving with the stiff-legged gait of an animal that had learned caution through painful experience. Ash was small for a military working dog, maybe 30 pounds of wiry muscle under a coat that had once been black, but was now mottled with gray scars from previous wounds. His left ear was torn halfway through from shrapnel, and he favored his right hind leg where an infected wound had never quite healed properly. He wasn't the impressive specimen that propaganda posters featured, but Corporal Danny Price, the dog's handler, insisted Ash was the best casualty detection animal in the division. Price staggered up beside Reese, his own face pale from the battering the barrage had delivered to everyone in the trench system. "Sir, Ash can find them. He's trained for this. Locating wounded under rubble, collapsed buildings, anywhere human searchers can't access quickly." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone offering a solution he knew sounded implausible to officers who trusted equipment and doctrine over animal instincts. Reese had seen Ash work once before, during fighting in a French village where the dog had located 3 wounded men trapped in a collapsed cellar. But that was different terrain, different conditions. Here, they faced trenches filled with snow, frozen ground, temperatures well below zero, and, most critically, German forces that intelligence suggested were preparing an armored assault designed to break through exactly this section of line. Every minute spent searching for buried soldiers was a minute not spent preparing defenses against tanks that would crush them if they weren't ready. But Reese also knew the mathematics of leadership. Men fought harder for officers who refused to abandon wounded. Morale, already fragile after weeks of cold and combat, would shatter completely if he ordered retreat without attempting rescue. And there was the simple, irreducible fact that American soldiers might be alive under that snow, suffocating, freezing, counting on someone to find them before cold or compression killed them. "Do it," Reese ordered. "But fast. German armor is probably staging for assault right now. We've got maybe 2 hours, 3 at most, before they hit us." He didn't mention what they both knew, that if Ash was working the forward trenches when German tanks arrived, neither dog nor handler would survive. Price gave Ash the command for casualty search, a specific hand signal followed by a German phrase the dog had been trained to recognize. Ironic, given they were fighting Germans, but the training program had originated with captured German methods. Ash's entire posture changed, focus intensifying in a way that suggested he understood the mission's importance. He moved toward the forward trenches with purpose, nose working the air and ground, tail straight behind him in the concentration position that indicated active searching. The first collapsed section was a crater 10 feet across where a shell had landed almost directly in the trench itself. Snow and dirt had filled the excavation, covering whatever had been there with a layer 3 feet deep. Hayes and 2 other soldiers were attempting to dig with entrenching tools, making almost no progress against frozen material that resisted every shovel thrust. Ash circled the crater twice, nose pressed close to the snow surface, then stopped at a specific point and began digging frantically with his front paws. Price called for the diggers to focus where Ash indicated. They attacked that spot with tools and bare hands, working with renewed intensity now that they had a specific target. Within 2 minutes, they'd uncovered a helmet, then a shoulder, then the face of Private Kowalski, unconscious but breathing, packed in snow that had probably saved him from worse injury by immobilizing his body during the collapse. They pulled him out carefully, checking for breaks and bleeding, then passed him to medics who moved him toward the aid station. Ash didn't wait for thanks or acknowledgement. The dog was already moving to the next collapsed section, tail rigid with concentration, following scents only he could detect beneath layers of material that blocked human senses. Price followed, watching for the signs that indicated Ash had located someone, the intensity of digging, the specific bark pattern, the refusal to move from a spot even when called. Reese watched them work and allowed himself the smallest sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull enough men out before the German armor arrived. Maybe Ash could give them the miracle they desperately needed. And maybe that would be enough to hold this frozen ridge when the tanks came grinding through the forest in the assault everyone knew was coming. If Ash's story has already captured your attention, if you're wondering how many men he'll save, and whether the company can survive what's approaching through those winter forests, make sure you're subscribed to follow this through to its conclusion. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on military working dogs and their unsung contributions, hit that like button, and share this with anyone who appreciates authentic war stories that deserve to be told. The next chapters will show you exactly what one small dog accomplished when everything else had failed. Ash found 4 more men in the first hour, each buried at different depths in collapsed trench sections that would have taken human searchers hours to excavate blindly. Private Chen was unconscious under 2 feet of snow, his leg twisted at an angle that suggested compound fracture. Corporal Williams had been packed so tightly in frozen earth that he couldn't expand his chest to breathe properly, face already turning blue when they pulled him free. Specialist Grant had a head wound that bled profusely once exposed to air, the cold having stanched the flow while he was buried. Private First Class DeMarco was the worst, both legs crushed by timber that had collapsed onto the trench, screaming as medics administered morphine they couldn't really spare before attempting to splint the damage. Each rescue followed the same pattern. Ash would circle a collapsed section, nose working systematically, then stop and dig with frantic intensity at a specific point. Price would call for the diggers, soldiers would attack the frozen ground with entrenching tools and pickaxes, and within minutes they'd uncover whoever Ash had detected. The dog's accuracy was perfect. Every location he marked contained a soldier, and every soldier he found was still alive, though some were closer to death than anyone wanted to acknowledge. But the rescues consumed time they didn't have. Reese checked his watch compulsively, knowing that each minute brought German armor closer. Intelligence reports from before the radio died had indicated enemy tank formations staging in the forest valleys below the ridge. The terrain favored armor, relatively open corridors between tree stands, frozen ground firm enough to support heavy vehicles, and multiple approach routes that would force defenders to spread their already inadequate strength across too much frontage. Hayes approached with news that made the tactical situation even grimmer. "Sir, observation post reports vehicle sounds from the northeast, maybe 2 miles out. Can't get visual through the fog, but it sounds like tracked vehicles, multiple units." He paused, face showing the calculation every experienced soldier was making. If it's armor, and they're already that close, we've got maybe 90 minutes before they're in assault range. 90 minutes to finish rescue operations, reorganize the defensive line, distribute what little anti-tank ammunition remained, and prepare for an attack they probably couldn't stop. The mathematics were brutal. Reese had perhaps 80 effective soldiers left after casualties from the barrage and 3 weeks of attrition. Against German armor supported by infantry, those 80 men would last minutes unless they had advantages that currently didn't exist. Ash continued working as if enemy tanks didn't factor into his mission calculus. The dog moved to another collapsed trench, this one in the most forward position where the company's observation posts had been located before the barrage. The ground here showed more dramatic destruction. Multiple shell impacts had cratered the entire area, creating overlapping zones of collapsed earth that made determining original trench locations nearly impossible. Price hesitated before following Ash into this section. "Sir, this is danger close to German lines. We're maybe 200 yards from their forward positions. If they spot activity, they'll call mortars on us." He didn't need to add that mortars would kill everyone in the area, including the men they were trying to rescue. Reese made the decision that command required. 5 minutes. If Ash finds someone in 5 minutes, we dig them out. If not, we pull back and focus on preparing the defense. It was cold calculation that weighed living soldiers against those who might already be dead. But leadership in combat often meant choosing between terrible options rather than good ones. Ash didn't need 5 minutes. Within 90 seconds, the dog had stopped at a specific location and begun the frantic digging that indicated a find. But this time, his behavior was different, more agitated, more urgent, with a specific bark pattern Price had learned, meant the detected person was in immediate danger. They dug quickly, soldiers working in rotation to maintain pace against exhaustion, and within 3 minutes had uncovered Lieutenant Carson, the forward observation officer, buried under nearly 4 feet of mixed snow and earth. Carson was alive, but in critical condition. The collapse had pinned him in a position that compressed his chest, and the weight of material above had prevented proper breathing for an extended period. His lips were blue-gray, his face waxy with the pallor of severe oxygen deprivation. The medic who examined him shook his head grimly. Carson needed immediate evacuation to a field hospital, treatment beyond what their depleted aid station could provide. But evacuation meant vehicles, roads, and time, none of which they possessed while German armor approached through the fog. They carried Carson toward the aid station anyway, because abandoning wounded violated something fundamental that kept soldiers functioning in the chaos of combat. Ash followed the stretcher bearers for a moment, as if ensuring his find was properly handled, then returned to searching. Price tried to recall him. They'd already exceeded the 5-minute limit Reese had set, but Ash ignored the command with the stubbornness of a dog that knew his job wasn't finished. The dog moved to the eastern edge of the collapsed trench system, an area so badly destroyed that it looked like the surface of an alien planet. Craters overlapping craters, timber and equipment scattered randomly, snow mixed with frozen earth in patterns that suggested violence rather than nature. Nobody expected survivors here. The destruction was too complete, the buried depth too great. But Ash circled the area with intense focus, nose pressed close to the ground, tail rigid with concentration. Then he stopped, but not with the digging behavior that indicated a buried soldier. Instead, Ash sat, head tilted, ears forward, in a posture Price had seen before but couldn't immediately place. The dog was detecting something but not a buried casualty. Something else. Price moved closer, following Ash's focused gaze toward what looked like a partially collapsed bunker entrance, half buried under debris from the barrage. The structure was German. They could tell by the construction style and the remains of camouflage netting. It shouldn't have been here. American positions had held this ridge for 2 weeks, and they'd mapped all German fortifications during that period. This bunker hadn't existed in their intelligence summaries, which meant it was either newly built or deliberately concealed. Reese joined them, immediately recognizing the tactical significance. That's deep in what we thought was our controlled zone. If there's a bunker there, what else did we miss? He studied the structure through binoculars, noting details that made his tactical sense scream warnings. The entrance faced away from German lines, toward American positions. The concealment was designed to hide it from American observation, not German approach. This wasn't a defensive position. It was something else. Hayes put it into words. Infiltration route. They built it behind our lines so they could move forces through without us seeing the approach. That's why the armor assault hasn't come yet. They're waiting until infiltration teams are in position to hit us from behind, while tanks attack from front. The explanation fit perfectly with German tactical doctrine, and with the uncomfortable reality that they'd been holding a ridge while enemy engineers prepared the ground for exactly this kind of combined assault. Ash's detection had just revealed that their tactical situation was worse than anyone had realized. They weren't just facing an armor assault from the front. They were facing encirclement, with German forces potentially already positioned behind their lines, waiting for the signal to attack. And they discovered this because a 30-pound dog with a torn ear had smelled something wrong while searching for buried soldiers. Reese made rapid decisions. Hayes, take a fire team and investigate that bunker. Carefully, if it's occupied. Don't engage unless you have to. Price, get Ash back to the command post. He's done enough. Both men moved to comply, understanding that the mission had just changed from rescue operations to survival against an enemy that had apparently been several steps ahead of them the entire time. Hayes and his fire team approached the bunker entrance with weapons ready, every man understanding they might be walking into an ambush that would end their war in seconds. The structure was more sophisticated than initial observations suggested, reinforced concrete rather than timber, built deep enough that the artillery barrage had damaged but not destroyed it. German engineering at its methodical best, designed to survive exactly the kind of bombardment that had devastated the American positions above. The entrance was partially blocked by debris, but a gap remained large enough for a man to squeeze through if he didn't mind tight spaces and the possibility of the entire structure collapsing on him. Hayes went first because that's what sergeants did. Crawling through the opening with his rifle awkwardly positioned, flashlight held in his teeth. The beam cut through darkness that smelled of disturbed earth and something else, recent human occupation, the distinctive odor of German tobacco and rations. Inside, the bunker opened into a chamber perhaps 15 feet across, fitted with communications equipment that had been hastily abandoned. Maps covered one wall, marked with German tactical symbols that Hayes couldn't fully interpret, but recognized as showing American positions with disturbing accuracy. Supply caches lined another wall. Ammunition, explosives, medical supplies, everything an infiltration team would need for sustained operations behind enemy lines. But no Germans. Whoever had occupied this position had left, probably when the artillery barrage began, and hadn't returned. What disturbed Hayes most was the tunnel leading deeper into the hillside, away from both American and German lines. This wasn't just a bunker. It was part of a network, possibly connecting to other concealed positions throughout the sector. The Germans hadn't just planned to attack the ridge. They'd prepared the battlefield weeks in advance, building infrastructure that would let them control movement and positioning, while Americans remained ignorant of what lay beneath their feet. He photographed what he could with a liberated German camera, gathered map documents that intelligence officers would want to examine, and withdrew before the bunker's structural damage progressed from concerning to catastrophic. Back at the surface, he reported findings to Reese that fundamentally changed their understanding of the tactical situation. Sir, that bunker connects to something bigger. Could be tunnels running all through this sector, could be supply routes, could be staging areas for forces we haven't detected yet. Hayes spread the captured maps on a flat section of trench wall, pointing to markings that showed American positions surrounded by German symbols, indicating observation posts, supply points, and what looked like pre-registered artillery targets. They know everything about our deployment. They've been watching us for days, maybe weeks. Reese studied the maps with growing dread. If German intelligence was this comprehensive, the armor assault wouldn't be a frontal attack hoping to break through. It would be a coordinated strike hitting multiple precisely identified weak points simultaneously, supported by forces already positioned to exploit any breakthrough. His 80 men weren't preparing to defend against an attack. They were already partially surrounded and didn't know it. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, audible now, even without listening equipment. The fog that had concealed German movements was lifting as temperature rose slightly, revealing glimpses of the forest below where tracked vehicles maneuvered between tree stands. Hayes counted at least 4 distinct engine sounds, suggesting a reinforced platoon of armor, probably Panzer IVs or Panthers, either of which would devastate American positions that lacked effective anti-tank weapons. Price arrived with Ash, the dog limping more noticeably now after hours of intense work. "Sir, medics have stabilized most of the wounded Ash found, but we can't evacuate them without vehicles, and we can't get vehicles up here with German armor controlling the approaches." He hesitated, knowing his next suggestion would sound absurd. "Ash is showing interest in the bunker area again. He keeps wanting to go back there like he's detecting something we missed." Reese wanted to dismiss it as a dog being distracted by interesting smells in a structure recently occupied by enemies. But Ash's track record over the past hours argued against casual dismissal. Every time the dog had indicated something, that indication had proven accurate and often critically important. If Ash was interested in the bunker area, there was probably a reason. "Let him check it out, but stay close and stay ready to pull back fast. We're about 15 minutes from German armor being in assault range, and when that starts, nothing else matters except surviving the first rush." Reese turned to Hayes. "Get every anti-tank weapon we have positioned on the most likely approach routes. Use those captured maps to guess where they'll hit hardest. We can't stop them, but maybe we can slow them enough to buy time for something to change." Price released Ash with the detection command, and the dog immediately moved toward the bunker entrance with renewed energy. But instead of entering the structure, Ash circled it, nose working the disturbed ground around the perimeter. Then he stopped at a point 20 feet from the entrance where snow had drifted against exposed rock, and began digging with the same frantic intensity he'd shown when locating buried soldiers. The diggers cleared snow and found something none of them expected: another entrance, this one better concealed than the first, leading into a tunnel that angled downward at a steep grade. Fresh boot prints in the tunnel mouth showed someone had used this route recently, probably within the last few hours. The tracks led down into darkness that suggested extensive underground construction. Hayes understood immediately. Secondary entrance for infiltration teams. They come up through the bunker, scout our positions, then return through this entrance so we never see surface movement. That's how they've been gathering intelligence without us detecting patrols. He played his flashlight beam down the tunnel, seeing evidence of regular use: trampled earth, discarded equipment, and most concerning, what looked like prepared demolition charges positioned to collapse the tunnel if needed. Reese made the hardest decision of a morning full of impossible choices. We collapse it now, all of it. Bunker, tunnel, whatever else connects to this network. If German infiltration teams are using it, we take that capability away, even if it means potentially trapping some of them underground. He looked at Hayes. "How much explosive do we have?" "Enough if we use everything including captured German charges in the bunker. But sir, if we bring down this section, it might collapse the trenches above. We could bury our own positions." Hayes didn't mention they might also bury wounded men who hadn't been evacuated yet, but the unspoken concern hung between them. Do it anyway. Better to fight from collapsed trenches than get hit from behind by forces we can't see coming. Reese checked his watch again, noting they had perhaps 10 minutes before German armor would be close enough to observe demolition preparations. 10 minutes to destroy enemy infrastructure, reorganize what remained of the defensive line, and prepare for an assault that would probably kill most of them. 10 minutes that Ash's detection work had given them by revealing threats they'd never suspected existed. Hayes worked with controlled urgency, placing demolition charges at structural points identified by engineers who'd studied the bunker construction during the brief exploration. The German explosives captured inside the bunker were superior to American equivalents, more stable, more powerful, designed for precision demolition rather than battlefield expedients. Ironic that German engineering would be used to destroy German infrastructure, but war was full of such contradictions. The charges were linked with detonation cord in a sequence designed to collapse the bunker inward first, then bring down the tunnel system in a progressive failure that would seal everything without causing surface damage extensive enough to compromise the American trench line. In theory, engineering calculations made under fire with inadequate equipment were notoriously unreliable, but they had no time for detailed planning or safety margins. Ash watched from a safe distance with Price, the dog's posture showing exhaustion that finally overwhelmed his drive to continue working. His paws were raw from digging through frozen ground. One eye was swollen nearly shut from impact with debris during the artillery barrage, and the limp had progressed to the point where he could barely put weight on his right hind leg. But he remained alert, head-tracking movements around the demolition site, as if understanding that this was the culmination of everything he'd worked toward that morning. Price offered water, and what remained of his own rations, which Ash accepted without enthusiasm. The dog's focus stayed on the bunker entrance, occasionally whining softly as if he detected something humans couldn't sense. Martinez had seen this behavior before during urban fighting in France, Ash reacting to underground sounds or movements that passed below human hearing threshold. If the dog was detecting something now, it likely meant Germans were still using the tunnel system, unaware that Americans had discovered and were preparing to destroy their carefully built infrastructure. The distant rumble of armor grew steadily louder. Through gaps in the lifting fog, Reese caught glimpses of German tanks maneuvering into assault positions, their commanders probably waiting for final orders before beginning the attack. Intelligence suggested German doctrine preferred coordinated strikes rather than piecemeal efforts, all elements moving simultaneously to overwhelm defenses. That coordination bought precious minutes for Hayes to complete demolition preparations. Reese used those minutes to reorganize his defensive line, pulling men back from forward positions that would be untenable once armor began firing and concentrating strength at choke points where terrain offered some advantage. The captured German maps helped immensely, showing which approaches were pre-registered for artillery and which avenues the enemy considered most vulnerable. He positioned his few remaining anti-tank weapons accordingly, though he harbored no illusions about stopping Panthers with obsolete bazookas and courage. The wounded presented an impossible problem. They'd recovered 11 men from collapsed trenches, plus additional casualties from the barrage who'd been above ground when shells landed. The aid station overflowed with soldiers who needed evacuation, but had no way to reach rear areas with German armor blocking every route. Medics did what they could with inadequate supplies, knowing that many wouldn't survive without treatment that wouldn't arrive in time. Hayes reported demolitions ready, waiting only for Reese's order to execute. The captain took one final look at the bunker entrance, the tunnel system, and the terrain that German engineers had spent weeks preparing for today's assault. Destroying it might not prevent the armor attack, but it would strip away the infiltration capability that made the German plan so dangerous. Sometimes you couldn't win. You could only make the enemy's victory more expensive than anticipated. "Blow it," Reese ordered. Hayes triggered the detonator. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the charges fired in sequence, muffled crumps that came so close together they blended into a rolling thunder that seemed to come from underground rather than the surface. The bunker entrance collapsed inward with a sound like breaking bones, concrete and earth folding into the space where the chamber had been. Secondary explosions followed as the progressive demolition reached ammunition stores Germans had cached in the tunnel system. The ground shook hard enough that soldiers in the trenches grabbed for support, fearing the entire hillside might collapse. Trees near the bunker swayed as if in high wind, roots disturbed by underground failures that changed the terrain's structural dynamics. Then, gradually, the shaking subsided, leaving only settling sounds as material found new equilibrium in spaces that had been artificially created and were now forcibly closed. Ash barked once, sharply, then fell silent. Price couldn't tell if it was approval, warning, or simply reaction to the ground motion. But the dog's attention had shifted from the demolished bunker to the forest below, where German armor was finally beginning its approach in earnest. Tank engines roared as drivers accelerated from staging areas toward assault positions, the sound carrying clearly in cold air that transmitted noise with brutal efficiency. Reese watched through binoculars as the first Panthers emerged from tree cover, turrets traversing to acquire targets on the ridge above. His defensive line was as ready as inadequate resources allowed. His men knew the odds. The wounded had been moved to the deepest bunkers that hadn't collapsed, and Ash, the 30-pound dog who'd spent the morning saving lives while surrounded by death, had given them information and time that changed terrible odds into merely catastrophic ones. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for. Sometimes, survival meant accepting losses while ensuring they cost the enemy more than they'd expected to pay. And sometimes, in the chaos of winter combat with German armor grinding up a frozen hillside, the difference between annihilation and costly victory came down to what a scarred mutt could smell beneath layers of snow that blind human senses. The first German tank fired, the shell screaming overhead to detonate somewhere behind the ridge. Range-finding shot, establishing distance and trajectory for the barrage that would follow. Reese gave the order to hold fire until armor was within effective range, knowing they'd get one good volley before German guns found them, and began systematic destruction of everything that moved on this frozen ridge that nobody would remember by any name, except the coordinates that marked where men died trying to hold ground that probably didn't matter in the grand strategy of winning the war. The 1st Panther took a direct hit from Sergeant Hayes's carefully positioned bazooka team, the shaped charge penetrating the thinner side armor and detonating inside with catastrophic results. The tank stopped, turret hatch blowing open as fire erupted from the crew compartment. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off, turning the vehicle into a funeral pyre that blocked the trail behind it and forced following armor to maneuver around the burning wreck. But one kill didn't stop the assault. 3 more Panthers emerged from different approaches, their commanders having learned from the first vehicle's destruction to spread out rather than advance in column. German doctrine emphasized flexibility, and these crews demonstrated it by firing on the move, suppressing American positions while maintaining momentum that would carry them onto the ridge within minutes. Reese's defensive line erupted with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, the few remaining bazookas, even grenades thrown desperately at armored vehicles they couldn't penetrate with small arms fire. The noise was overwhelming. A continuous roar punctuated by tank cannon fire that systematically destroyed American positions one by one. The frozen ground offered no protection against 75mm shells designed to kill other tanks. Against infantry in trenches, they were instruments of absolute destruction. Price had pulled Ash back to the command post bunker. The safest position available, though safe, was relative when armor was overrunning your perimeter. The dog was exhausted beyond anything Price had seen, lying on his side with flanks heaving, paws still bleeding from hours of work that had saved 11 lives but couldn't save them from what was happening now. Price sat beside him, one hand on Ash's shoulder, feeling the animal's rapid heartbeat through matted fur. They'd done everything possible. If it wasn't enough, at least they'd tried. A Panther reached the collapsed bunker area, the commander apparently unaware that his infiltration route had been destroyed. The tank's treads ground over the disturbed earth, then suddenly broke through as the ground beneath gave way where demolition charges had created voids insufficiently filled by collapsed material. The 50-ton vehicle dropped nose first into the crater, turret slamming against intact ground with impact that probably killed or injured the crew. The Panther's engine screamed as the driver tried to reverse, but the tank was stuck. Angled steeply down into a hole its own weight continued to enlarge. Hayes saw the opportunity immediately and directed fire against the immobilized tank. Bazookas struck the thinner top armor, grenades were lobbed into the exposed engine compartment, and within seconds the Panther was burning like its destroyed companion. 2 kills didn't stop the assault, but they created obstacles that channeled remaining armor into narrower approaches where American weapons had marginally better chances. The battle descended into the kind of chaos that no after-action report could properly capture. Isolated firefights, individual acts of desperate courage, soldiers making split-second decisions that determined whether they lived or died. German infantry had joined the assault now, advancing behind the armor to exploit any breakthrough. The Americans fought from collapsed trenches, from shell craters, from whatever cover existed, knowing that retreat meant abandoning wounded who couldn't move on their own. Reese was coordinating defense from 3 positions when a shell detonated close enough to throw him against the trench wall with force that cracked ribs and knocked him unconscious. Hayes found him minutes later, face bloody, breathing but unresponsive. The sergeant made rapid assessment. Reese was alive but combat ineffective, which meant command had just devolved to whoever was next in the chain. That was Hayes himself, promoted by casualty rather than orders, leading what remained of the company because everyone senior was dead or wounded. He took stock of their situation, with the grim clarity combat experience provided. They'd killed 2 Panthers and damaged a 3rd. German infantry had taken casualties from defensive fire but kept pressing. American ammunition was running critically low. The wounded filled every bunker and protected space, and German armor was maybe 5 minutes from reaching positions where American weapons couldn't effectively engage before being overrun. Ash appeared beside Hayes with Price following, both moving carefully through terrain now cratered by tank fire. The dog was limping badly, barely able to walk, but his focus remained sharp. He was indicating something again, nose pointed northeast, away from the main German assault, toward terrain that American defenders had mostly abandoned to concentrate strength against the armor attack. Price interpreted Ash's signal with the expertise of a handler who'd worked with this dog through months of combat. He's detecting movement, multiple people coming from that direction. Could be German infiltration teams using another route we didn't find. His voice carried resignation. If Germans were flanking through terrain they'd abandoned, the position was truly lost. But Hayes looked at the direction Ash indicated and felt something shift in his understanding. Northeast was toward American lines, not German positions. If Ash was detecting movement from there, it might not be enemies. It might be the relief everyone had stopped expecting. He grabbed binoculars and scanned the indicated direction, seeing nothing through smoke and fog that obscured everything beyond 100 yards. But sound carried. Vehicle engines. Different from the German armor they'd been fighting. American engines. Distinctive diesel rumble of M4 Shermans, rather than the higher-pitched gasoline engines German tanks used. The relief column appeared through the fog like an answer to prayers nobody had bothered making anymore. 8 Sherman tanks, infantry riding on their hulls, advancing in tactical formation that spoke of professional competence. They'd been dispatched when communications failed, sent to investigate why the company had gone silent, arriving just in time to turn a last stand into something survivable. The Shermans engaged German armor with advantages of surprise and numbers, their 76mm guns cracking through the morning air, with reports that sounded like salvation. The remaining Panthers tried to reposition, but caught between defenders on the ridge and relief forces behind them. They were trapped in a killing zone without good options. German infantry began withdrawing, combat discipline preventing rout, but unable to disguise the fact that their assault had failed. Hayes used a borrowed radio to coordinate with the relief force commander, providing targeting information and requesting immediate medical evacuation for the worst wounded. The officer acknowledged, already directing his supporting infantry to secure the ridge and establish a proper defensive perimeter that would hold even if Germans regrouped for another assault. As the firing decreased and the immediate crisis passed, Hayes returned to where Ash lay with Price. The dog had finally allowed exhaustion to claim him, sleeping with the depth that came after pushing beyond normal limits. His work had started by finding buried soldiers and ended by detecting the relief force that saved everyone he'd worked so hard to protect. Whether you called it training, instinct, or something else entirely, Ash had given them the margins they needed when margins meant survival. The aid station was chaos organized by exhausted medics who'd been working non-stop since the artillery barrage began 9 hours earlier. Wounded lined every available surface, some on stretchers, others on blankets laid directly on frozen ground. The relief force had brought medical supplies and additional corpsmen, but even with reinforcement, treating casualties from a morning of brutal combat required hours of methodical work that tested everyone's physical and mental reserves. Captain Reese regained consciousness in the early afternoon, ribs taped, head bandaged, vision still slightly blurred from concussion. His first question was about casualties. Hayes delivered the numbers with the flat affect of someone who'd counted too many dead friends. 19 killed outright, 32 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, another 15 with injuries that allowed them to remain with the unit. Of the original company that had held the ridge, barely a third remained combat effective. But it could have been worse. Without Ash's detection work finding buried soldiers, without the discovered bunker revealing German infiltration routes, without the early warning that allowed defensive preparation, the casualties would have been catastrophic rather than merely devastating. Hayes reported those facts to Reese, who nodded slowly, processing information through the fog of head trauma and exhaustion. Price sat with Ash near the aid station, having convinced a veterinary corpsman attached to the relief force to examine the dog. The assessment was concerning. Ash had torn pads on all 4 paws, a cracked rib from impact with debris, severe exhaustion, and the infected leg wound had worsened significantly. The corpsman administered antibiotics and pain medication, splinted the ribs, and bandaged the paws, but his expression showed professional doubt about whether even that treatment would be sufficient. "He needs rest," the corpsman said, stating the obvious because sometimes medical reality required voicing even when everyone already understood. "Weeks of it, ideally in a rear area where he's not working. But even with rest, that leg infection is serious. He might not regain full function." The unspoken subtext was that military dogs with permanent disabilities were often euthanized as no longer fit for purpose. Price's face showed the kind of determination that had carried him through 2 years of combat. "He's coming home with me when this war ends. I don't care what regulations say about disposition of military animals. Ash has earned retirement wherever he wants it, and he's already chosen. He wants to be wherever I am." The certainty in his voice made arguing pointless. Some decisions transcended military authority. As evening approached, engineers from the relief force examined the collapsed bunker system, documenting what German forces had built and how Americans had discovered and destroyed it. Their report would go to Division Intelligence, then higher, eventually becoming part of the analytical database that helped commanders understand enemy capabilities and methods. The bunker network was extensive, tunnels reaching nearly a mile in multiple directions, connecting observation posts, supply caches, and staging areas that would have allowed German forces to operate behind American lines with devastating effectiveness. That such infrastructure had existed undetected for weeks was embarrassing to American intelligence. That a medic dog had found it while searching for buried casualties was the kind of improbable detail that made the report seem fictional. But the physical evidence was undeniable, documented in photographs and measurements that verified every claim. Ash had accomplished what trained intelligence personnel and sophisticated reconnaissance assets had missed. 3 days later, the company was withdrawn from the ridge for rest and reconstitution. They loaded into trucks that carried them away from terrain they defended at terrible cost, terrain that would be held by someone else now, terrain that most of them hoped never to see again. Ash rode in the command vehicle with Price and Hayes, lying on blankets with his bandaged paws elevated, accepting water and food when offered, but mostly sleeping with the depth of exhaustion that suggested his body was using every available resource for healing. The veterinary hospital in the rear area provided treatment more sophisticated than field medicine allowed. Surgeons cleaned and debrided the infected leg wound, discovering that shrapnel from an earlier engagement had embedded deep in muscle tissue, creating the persistent infection that antibiotics alone couldn't resolve. The surgery was successful, but Ash would carry a permanent limp that ended his career as an active working dog. Price filed the adoption paperwork immediately, supported by testimony from Reese, Hayes, and every officer who'd witnessed Ash's contributions on that frozen ridge. The approval came through faster than military bureaucracy typically moved, perhaps because someone in the administrative chain recognized that some stories deserved exceptions to standard procedures. Ash became officially Price's dog rather than military property, ensuring they'd return to civilian life together when the war eventually ended. The company received commendations for their defense of Hill 447, the official designation that would appear in histories rather than the Hell Ridge name soldiers actually used. Individual awards followed. Hayes received a battlefield commission to lieutenant for his leadership during the crisis. Reese was promoted and given a staff position while recovering from injuries. Numerous enlisted soldiers received Bronze Stars for valor. And Ash, in a ceremony that felt more meaningful than some human decorations, was awarded a special commendation recognizing his service and the lives he'd saved through dedication that transcended species boundaries. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary detection work under combat conditions, locating 11 wounded soldiers buried in collapsed trenches, and for discovering enemy infiltration routes that prevented American forces from being surprised by coordinated assault." Ash demonstrated courage, dedication, and capabilities that exemplify the finest traditions of military service dogs. Price kept that citation with him through the remaining months of the war and into the peace that followed. He and Ash returned to Iowa in the autumn of 1945, settling into civilian life that felt strange after years of combat, but gradually became normal through the routine of daily existence. Ash adapted to farm life with the same competence he'd shown in military service, though his working days were finished and his role became primarily companionship. Years later, when Price was asked about the war, he would talk about the ridge, the artillery, the desperate morning when everything seemed lost. And he would always mention Ash, the small dog with torn ears and a permanent limp who'd saved more lives in a single morning than most soldiers saved in entire deployments. The story was improbable enough that some listeners doubted details, but Price had documentation, photographs, and the memories of men who'd been there when a 30-pound mutt proved that courage wasn't measured by size or species. Ash lived to be 12 years old, which was good for a dog that had survived what he'd experienced. When he died peacefully in his sleep in 1953, Price buried him on the farm with military honors, a flag, a moment of silence, and a marker that read simply, "Ash, medic dog, hero." It was understated compared to what the dog deserved, but Price believed Ash would have preferred simplicity over elaborate recognition. If this story touched something in you, if you're thinking about the unsung animals who've served alongside human soldiers in every conflict, take a moment to share it with others who might appreciate knowing that heroism comes in forms we don't always expect. Subscribe to continue exploring authentic military history that honors all who served. Comment with your thoughts on working dogs and their contributions, and hit that like button to help ensure these stories reach the audience they deserve. Sometimes the most important tales are the ones that almost get forgotten because they seem too improbable to be true. Ash's story was real. The lives he saved were real. And the lesson about trusting capabilities we don't fully understand remains relevant long after the battles end and the soldiers come home.